I have been given 2 international finance topics to research and analyze. The first is the financial crisis in Venezuela from the time period of 2012 on. The second is the financial crisis in Southeast Asia from the time period of 1997 and 1998. Before taking this class, I was unaware of finance internationally. This class has been eye-opening on these topics. I really didn't realize how important trade relationships were between countries, and I learned a lot about that in researching these 2 topics. While researching on these particular subjects, I learned a lot about the culture in Venezuela and Asia as well. Let's see here. While researching the financial crisis in Venezuela around the time period of 2012, I learned a lot about their leader, Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias, mostly known as Hugo Chavez. I think it's important to know a little bit about their leader before discussing the crisis in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez was born July 28, 1954 in Sabaneta, Venezuela. Chavez was the second of 6 children. Both of his parents were school teachers and made little money. Their family came from major poverty. Let's see here. Because of the lack of money, Chavez and one of his brothers were sent to Barinas to live with his grandmother. His grandmother was very influenced by politics. Chavez's love for politics came from his grandmother. Rosa Chavez. She instilled a love of history and politics into Chavez's life. In 1971, Chavez enlisted in the Venezuelan Military Academy. On February 4th of 1982, Chavez and a group of military officers attempted to overthrow the government of President at the time, Carlos Andrés Perez. Unfortunately, the rebellion was a failure. Chavez was not able to complete the reason for the mission, which was to capture the president. Trapped in the military history museum near the presidential palace, Chavez realized that it was useless to keep fighting, and he agreed to surrender on the condition that he be allowed to address his co-conspirators on national television. Chavez spoke for less than 2 minutes, but this became the beginning of his life as a politician. Many Venezuelans at that time were unhappy with their elected leaders, and they were inspired by Chavez and praised his bold ideas to reform the country. His address became known as the Por Ahora speech, which means for now, because many people took that specific phrase as a promise that one day he would return. In December of 98, he won the presidential election with 56% of the vote. Chavez passed away March 5th, 2013 due to cancer. Since then, Venezuela has not performed well as a country. Venezuela is known for food shortages, hunger, lack of medicine, and homicide rates. Less than a year after the death of Hugo Chavez, Venezuela was on verge of an economic collapse. Inflation was higher than ever. Their currency was losing value drastically, and the foreign currency reserves were narrowing. Even Venezuela's energy sector, that was hurt by lack of investment, was failing to generate enough revenue to subsidize domestic giveaways. There is a difference between Venezuela and the rest of Latin America, which now has very solid macroeconomy fundamentals. Juan Pablo Fuentes, an economist at Moody's Analytics, told CNBC. The macroeconomy for the last 20 years has been very mismanaged. Recently, hundreds of people across Venezuela fought to get into electronic stores after the government ordered stores to cut prices. Some of these stores were guarded by soldiers. The soaring inflation put appliances and other goods beyond the reach of most of the population. Rather than acknowledging what most experts agree is the role of the inflation, President Maduro blamed the retailers themselves. Following the Chavez style, Maduro blamed the private sector for the country's problems. The government signed a decree that capped profit margins and that further tightened import regulations. His move gained praise from his supporters, but was condemned from critics of the government. The opposition coalition said in a statement, You cannot beat inflation by decrees, but with sensible economic policies. Venezuela ran a public sector deficit of about 15% of gross domestic product. According to Moody's, Venezuela's GDP was close to $300 billion if calculated to the official exchange rate of 6.3 bolivars, which is Venezuela's currency, to the dollar. However, Fuentes said the unofficial exchange rate set by the black market is close to 50 bolivars to the dollar, which was a gigantic leap from January when that rate stood at 17.3 to 1. The inflation rate soared. That prompted the state to expand price controls, and some economists saw the problem getting worse. Fuentes wrote in a note at the time, Venezuela might face triple-digit inflation by early next year. As things stood, the country was running out of tools to prevent an extensive economic crisis. International currency reserves were at an 8-year low, falling 26% between the end of 2012 and mid-September to 22 billion, Fuentes wrote. In addition, China, Venezuela's main financer, became stingier after earlier loans to promote oil production failed to produce results. Its Oil for Influence program, Petrocaribe, has also seen better times. The Chavez-era alliance was designed to unite several countries in the region, all of which were to receive oil from Venezuela on favorable terms, but those conditions changed. Guatemala said that they were pulling out of the program after Venezuela changed repayment terms for its oil. Other Latin American and Caribbean nations, including the Dominican Republic, were hit with interest rate increases and heftier upfront payments. As Venezuela became increasingly dependent on Chinese credit, the Asian economic heavyweight can obtain Venezuelan oil on far more favorable terms than the members of Petrocaribe ever did. China pays for only half of the oil it gets from Venezuela. The other half covers the debt. Oil production at Petróleos de Venezuela declined from a peak of 3.5 million barrels a day to 2.5 million barrels a day. To maintain steady output, oil producers had to consistently invest in shipping and pipeline capabilities, as well as in the broader supply chain. According to John Felmy, chief economist at the American Petroleum Institute, if they are not ready to make the investment, there will be a decline in production, he said. If Maduro continues the policy of Chavez, it is not a good sign for Venezuela. Venezuela's oil revenues cannot cover its mounting social spending and internal debt, experts say. According to Felmy at API, the country has a problem similar to one faced by other Latin American countries. The state runs the oil companies, and its spending priorities often focus on public programs rather than on reinvesting in energy infrastructure. Venezuela's government also gives generous subsidies for gasoline, which, in addition to consuming revenue, provides an incentive for the black market. For example, a gallon of premium gasoline goes for 3 or 4 cents in Venezuela, while in Colombia the price is about $6. Imagine the huge business you can make just sending gasoline to Colombia, Palma said. But like that of Chavez, the Maduro government gives little indication of changing its economic policy. The government is irresponsibly blaming the private sector for all the problems in the economy, Palma said. We are on the verge of getting into a much deeper economic crisis. Venezuela's chances to recover may start with President Maduro stepping down or being forcibly removed, either by the opposition or through foreign military intervention. But that would just be the first step to get the ruined economy onto the road of recovery. Venezuela will likely need help from multinational institutions such as the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Development Bank of Latin America in order to fund the infrastructure development. It is not rare for a South American country attempting to recover from an economic crisis to accept large loans. The U.S. government has indicated it would offer both investment and credit to the country, but only after regime change to democratic government. Leadership negotiations are set to resume later this week, according to Carlos Trujillo, a Venezuelan diplomat representing the opposition who spoke at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The lack of human capital is another issue Venezuela will have to address in order to recover from its economic crisis. Venezuela has lost more than 10% of its population in recent years. The number of Venezuelan migrants and refugees has reached 4 million and is expected to surpass 5.3 million by the end of this year. Many of those who have fled will most likely not return. They are making their living elsewhere. Their children are attending college and are finally comfortable after starting from zero in a foreign land. The idea of leaving everything behind to return to Venezuela and help rebuild the country is not appealing for most. Venezuela is taking a huge loss of human capital more than anything else. And whenever a country loses such a large number of people, it's not those who remain behind aren't capable, but a lot of those who left are the educated and the wealthy, the kind of people you need to rebuild a country. Venezuela will have to develop a new professional class through steps including the reformulation of its education system, which will take years to accomplish. The next topic I researched was the financial crisis in Southeast Asia from the time period of 1997 to 1998. The Asian financial crisis was also referred to as the Asian contagion, which was the collapse of the Thai baht in July 1997. It was followed by an unmatched financial crisis in East Asia, from which those economies are still struggling to recover. A great deal of effort has been devoted to trying to understand its causes. One view is that there was nothing inherently wrong with East Asian economies, which have historically performed well. These economies experienced a surge in capital inflows to finance productive investments that made them vulnerable to a financial panic. That panic and inadequate policy responses triggered a region-wide financial crisis and the economic disruption that followed. An alternative view is that weaknesses in Asian financial systems were at the root of the crisis. These weaknesses were caused largely by the lack of incentives for effective risk management created by implicit or explicit government guarantees against failure. The economic shocks affecting East Asia were not followed by a normal downturn, but what some describes as runs on financial systems and currencies. Some argue that these runs reflected a classic financial panic that did not reflect poor economic policies or institutional arrangements. All is well known, even well-managed banks or financial intermediaries are vulnerable to panics because they traditionally engage in maturity transformation. Two characteristics common in countries that have experienced financial crisis were present in a number of East Asian economies. First, financial intermediaries were not always free to use business criteria in allocating credit. In some cases, well-connected borrowers could not be refused credit, and others, poorly managed firms could obtain loans to meet some government policy objective. Second, financial intermediaries or their owners were not expected to bear the full cost of failure, reducing the incentive to manage risk effectively. Closer integration with world financial markets adds dimensions of vulnerability that are not present in a closed economy. In a closed economy, bad loans caused by risky lending may not lead to a run because depositors know that the government can supply enough liquidity to financial institutions to prevent any losses to depositors. In an open economy, that same injection of liquidity can destabilize the exchange rate. As a result, during periods of uncertainty, runs or speculative attacks on a currency can be avoided only if holders of domestic assets are assured that the government can meet the demand for foreign currency. Although these time periods were decades apart, they had some similarities throughout their struggles as a country. Both Venezuela and Southeast Asia had extreme currency failures, and both countries found some relief by receiving loans. These devaluations within Southeast Asia led to high inflation and a host of problems that spread as wide as South Korea and Japan. After researching these topics, I learned a lot about the two countries and how they came to be financially unstable and what actions have been taken to make these countries stronger than they were.